agriculture is still the most impactful sector on climate change, emissions, land degradation, biodiversity loss, and so on. Current consumer tastes and also the types of agriculture that we generally do, which is the monoculture or livestock, So figuring out, okay, how do we not sacrifice our ability to feed ourselves, because that's pretty important, while also utilizing approaches that don't make it harder and harder each time to produce the same quantity of food, quality of food, without resorting to a bunch of artificial input. It's like this vicious cycle, because the more artificial inputs you use, in many cases, combined with that unsustainable type of agriculture, just further degrades the ability of that ecosystem to produce food.
Hey everybody, Chike Farrell here with another episode of Sustainability in the Global South, brought to you by Sustain You and the Caribbean Ideas Group. And today is going to be a really fun conversation because I'm here with Omar Mohammed. Omar, we're going to talk a lot about the interesting things that you're doing at the Cropper Foundation and some of your fun background. So, Omar is really taking a really unique approach, pushing the envelope of, what NGOs can do to advance sustainability. But, before we even go there, first of all, welcome. Thanks for taking the time. You have a really interesting background. So I think today I'm going to switch it up a little bit. I kind of want to hear a little bit about, the journey that you have been on. I mean, of course, today you are leading the Cropper Foundation and we'll hear all about that. But maybe let's start with, tell us where you're from in the country and some of your academic and professional journey.
Yeah, well, I'm from Marabella, which is South Trinidad. So I'm a South boy for Trinbagonians. You might know there's some kind of distinction there. So I grew up in a very, I suppose, diverse family. They were all very academic and not necessarily into science like I became. Everyone did languages and history.
Okay.
So for most of my childhood, I was a voracious reader. I always tell the story. I got the Chronicles of Narnia books when I was 7. I slept in my cupboard for 3 months because I was convinced that, this was clearly how things happen.
Right.
And, since then, I was always really interested in two things. I wanted to be either an astronaut or an environmentalist. And then I got to Form 6 at NAPREMA, and I tried math for one day in Form 6. I said, this isn't for me. So I, pivoted to environment because I've always been, really interested in the world and how things within the world operate with one another. And that led me to my undergrad, which was environmental and natural resource management. And that basically kicked off my career because I went to volunteer at this place called the Cropper Foundation.
Yeah. That
honestly I didn't really know too much about, but like when you leave university, you kind of look for the first thing you could find. And I knew someone who was working there. And they said, yeah, I'll arrange an interview. So I went and we had a great chat. And they said, well, they don't really have anything right now, but if I know anyone who can build websites, let them know. So I said, oh, well, I can build a website. And they said, well, nice try, basically.
Like somebody who can read.
Yeah, exactly. So I said, no. I taught myself, this is of course back in the day.
Right.
I taught myself like CSS and HTML just randomly 1 year. So she said, well, okay, sure, if you want to start. So I built their website. And by the time I was done, there was a space. So I started working in education, sustainability education.
Okay.
And that kind of kicked off, quite a long journey. That's
I didn't realize that you had this sort of full circle thing where that's where you started and that's where you are now. So you started doing the website, but then so what kind of happened after that?
Well, I started working, like I said, in education for sustainability.
Sure.
And I said sure because again, coming out of university, it's a paying job. So I said, yeah, I didn't really know that education meant something besides teaching. I honestly thought that's what education meant. The same way I thought engineering meant to just fix cars. I didn't know there was different types. Because again, nobody in my family ever did science.
Sure.
So I started doing that. And we worked for quite a long time on this idea of education for sustainability, which, is very different to education on or about sustainability. So it's not really talking about this is what development is or environment. It's about how education as an institution or a concept could actually foster sustainability.
Okay.
So that really opened up my eyes to a lot of the social aspects around sustainability that, in university, in sciences, you don't really get exposed to quite a lot. You do the science bit, you could touch on maybe law and policy here and there, but you don't really understand that the concept of sustainability, understanding at that time is really so complex and there's so many different drivers. So understanding that how we've set up our education system, or probably I should say how we've been kind of handed down our education system.
Yes.
Does not really provide mindsets that you need to be sustainable. So something as simple as the fact that at secondary school or primary school all the way up to secondary school, you're so individualistic. You want to place whatever position in test. You don't ever do group work.
Right.
You do your SBAs or your sort of in-course assignments individually. And then when you get to university, you get thrown into a group and no one knows how to function.
Right.
So, if you extrapolate that to people who might not go to university and you go into the world of work, you have no experience about how to deal with groups. And again, that's a fundamental part of sustainability, understanding other people's viewpoints and how to, get change going in a group itself. So something as simple as that realization, I was like, oh wow, there's so much more things beside the fact that you want to reduce pollution in the environment, So that for me really kicked off a different way of looking at a lot of these issues.
Okay. So now so from that job, so now you were gone into other things. What are some of the other things that you did sort of in between then and sort of the role that you have now?
So after 5 years there at Crabble Foundation, I moved on to the National Commission for UNESCO.
Okay.
And I was their first ever coordinator for their sort of formal school program here in Trinidad and Tobago, which was interesting because, again, I worked in education for sustainability for those years, but I was never trained in education. And that was a really interesting sort of diversion for 3 years because it really threw me headfirst into what you can call like adjectival education. So it's like climate change education, education for equality, sustainability education. So all these different adjectives you can add to education. And it really showed me, again, how it converted me, I have to say. I'm a real big believer in the power of education, not just, as a sort of great emancipator thing, but how much of a social engineering tool it can be. And therefore how
100%.
we've not used it to any great impact in that regard. So I did that for some time. I worked quite a lot on issues around bullying, school violence, inequality in education, as well as climate change education as well. And so I was able to do quite a lot of work in the region, in addition to Trinidad and Tobago, on things like climate change education, what that means for the Caribbean, as well as lucky enough to work with UNESCO's sort of global program on school bullying and inequality. And then after that, when you're at a certain point, you say, okay, well, maybe I can try to just do things on my own. So for a couple of years, I just sort of did, work at consultancies and had time to cook my own meals and go to the gym and, had a really good life there. And then a colleague of mine reached out to me from United Way, and that they were starting a program on the SDGs and civil society, and if I would be interested in helping lead that. So I said, yeah, it sounds really exciting. So I did that for about a year, and that project was really a way of looking at how a civil society can get together to do collective advocacy to drive the sustainable development goals mandate that the country has. And then after that, in 2018, the opportunity came up to come back to Cropper Foundation, now as the Chief Executive Officer.
Okay.
And we all have these kind of internal thoughts like, do I really want to revisit that? Do I really want to go back? But, as we will probably talk about, the foundation was such a foundational aspect of my growing up and seeing the world that I really felt a really deep obligation in what I thought the organization could do and what I thought needed to happen within the region. That I, for one, as someone who was sort of kind of in and out of the civil society space and the sustainability space, was seeing not happening.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, I'll send it as application. I sent it in, I'm not even joking, I have the email at 4:58 p.m. and the deadline was 5 because I was so back and forth about it.
Right.
And here we are, 5 or 6 years later. Yeah.
Amazing. So, and actually, you know what, of the ones of these that I've done, you're probably the first person who actually studied environmental science or something like that in university, and then has kind of taken the path, which is actually great for anybody who's a student who's like, oh, how do I kind of go? That's one path. But what's also super interesting as I'm kind of like listening to you is, but your path, even though it sort of started there, you said repeatedly, right? Like, okay, but what I learned might be very different than what I sort of then realized as I kind of got into it. And then you've kind of taken this winding way and you've gone from environmental science to now running the foundation. So now's probably a good time to help people understand what the Cropper Foundation is and where it focuses. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
So the foundation was started in 2000. I mean, there's some disagreement whether it's 1999 when they actually started doing work, but they were officially started as an organization in 2000.
Okay.
So it depends on who you ask. We're either celebrating 24 years or 25.
Right.
But we were started by a husband and wife, John and Angela Cropper, who were both really sort of luminaries in their fields. John being an Englishman who came to UWI in I believe the late 60s, early 70s to do agriculture, because of course, the university was predominantly a place that started in tropical agriculture. And Angela was a Trinidadian who grew up in South Trinidad, and they worked for most of their careers in public life. So in different ways, Angela was much more the policy side of things. She worked at CARICOM. She was the first ever secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity when it first started. And John was more along the lines of setting up agricultural systems in different places. And it started, one, they wanted a way to give back in their retirement, but also their only son had died in 1998. Their only child had died in 1998 at university in London School of Economics. And it sort of rearranged how they saw that particular tool of a foundation. So it was a way to not just give back for themselves, but also a way to give back to the Caribbean in memory of their child. And so that's why the foundation's first work actually was around Caribbean creative writing, which many people don't know.
Oh, yeah.
So for 25 years, we've run this Cropper Foundation Emerging Creative Writers for the Caribbean workshop. And it's become, some say, the most influential workshop of its kind in the last 2 decades. Most, I think, star writers that have come out from the Caribbean, chances are, if you look back, that would have been their first workshop.
Okay.
People, like, Shivani Ramalochan here, it's some fantastic people. And so cut to 2001, where, again, another tragedy happened. There was this, a lot of people still know about it. Angela's husband, John, and her mother and her daughter, her sister, were victims of this triple homicide. And that kind of, again, reshaped what the foundation was really meant to provide, which now became a space to talk about, how you come around together as a collective to help not just solve problems around sustainability, but it really became like a close-knit family, the actual ethos of the foundation.
Okay.
And that's sort of what's kept on going since then. But the work of the foundation still continues a lot of that legacy work. So we have programs in agriculture that still continue to this day. And we have shifted how we work in policy over the years. We worked pretty much directly with policymakers in the early stages. And we've kept that up, but we've also integrated just diverse approaches at seeing how we can come into different policy arguments or policy directions, using different tools, different approaches, while also always ensuring that whatever we do is informed by best available science and so on. So today we do work, again, across sustainable agriculture. We work in climate justice, biodiversity and ecosystems. We've been trying to experiment over the last couple of years to some level of success with some new concepts around things like natural capital, and therefore how businesses can utilize that kind of thinking plus others to become more integrated into conversations around sustainability. We've also been dabbling quite a bit on the technology and computer science and how that could be used in service of not just sustainability, but also the work that civil society does. And then we've really doubled down on supporting civil society as a whole. So not just environmental groups and sustainability groups, but the sector as an institution that holds governments and states and other stakeholders accountable for good governance and sustainability and so on.
Love that. And I think one of the things that when you and I were first kind of talking that caught my attention, given all my sort of time and years in technology, was this idea that you have been very science forward, very technology forward. So let's really start as we dig in, peel back the onion a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about that. So why is that important, and why is that a part of the ethos of what you've been doing recently?
So I think it starts in a couple of ways. One, again, I always fancy myself some level, but once you get to the math, I kind of say, okay, fine, I'm backing off. But like anybody from, I think, my generation, millennial, we were, I think, the first generation to have that kind of, you had a clear pre-computer internet sort of life, and then sort of discovered, how impactful this could be. So that, of course, I think influenced anyone from this generation. But also, as we did our work, it became more and more obvious that the technology in and of itself is a tool. And technology, like we saw, again, growing up, the cost of use of it tends to drastically reduce as time goes on.
Of course, yeah.
So things often seem at first glance, we can't afford that. But you just wait a year or two and somehow price goes down, you have open source technology and so on, and it becomes more available, becomes more accessible to people. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that, the Caribbean as a region is, I think, one of the most resource constrained areas in the world. And not just in terms of land size, but also financial resources, human resources, capital. So we're trying to do all these things in reaction to, things that we might not necessarily be responsible for, in a way that requires resource levels that we don't have. And because of all these issues around, how we label as a region, high income countries, out of development assistance lists and so on, in many cases that doesn't equate to getting the kind of funding that you need.
Of course.
So what's the best way of trying to combat that? We thought maybe trying to find technology that could support some of these ambitions might be the place to go. And coming at it from a civil society perspective, because again, you have this resource constrained region, but then you have this group of actors that are trying to make an impact civil society. You are probably way worse in terms of constraints than private sector government, because you operate with practically nothing.
Sure.
So the idea was, okay, could we see how we can try to move the needle with that group of stakeholders to get them at least more familiar and more comfortable with using technology to deliver their impact?
But I mean, technology is, to your point, technology is sort of one of the major potential equalizers that we have, coming from a small place. So you're right, if you can kind of utilize that, maybe kind of create a force multiplier. What was an example of a project that, comes to mind that I guess showcases sort of how you've been trying to utilize technology, but in this sort of way to support sustainability or beyond?
Well, we have quite a lot of pipeline projects.
Okay.
So we have things that are down on paper. We've been trying to see how we get them funded. One, though, that we did with TT Lab out of the University of West Indies in St. Augustine, Professor Patrick Hussain, was called FAIR, FAIR, which is farming adaptation through artificial intelligence. And I can't remember what the R means, but it's called FAIR.
Right.
And it was a National Geographic funded project.
Okay.
And the idea was, how could we utilize some of the advances in remote sensing technology for farmers that are all the rage now in the US and Europe and so on, using drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, and what's the sort of replicability of that in the Caribbean? But then, of course, as we started looking at it, we realized, well, these drones basically fly over hundreds of acres of land, and they're all super complicated, a lot of technology, really expensive. But that's because the farmers that oftentimes use these technologies are not necessarily small farmers who are trying to put two coins together.
Right. They might be like massive
conglomerates of agriculture.
Kansas or somewhere. Right. Yeah. Okay.
So we said, okay, is there a way that we could utilize this technology in a way that makes sense for places like the Caribbean, starting in Trinidad and Tobago? So the idea was that maybe we can use AI or an ecosystem of artificial intelligence models to figure out how to mimic the results from remote sensing technology and sensors on some of these more expensive drones into programs that can be used on a cheaper drone that uses like a regular RGB camera. So what we did was, of course, we bought one of these super expensive drones, and also realized that literally sometimes the technology itself isn't cut out, because these drones are pre-programmed to turn on in terms of sensors at a certain height. And what we found is that pre-programmed height was way too high to get resolution on a farm that's 2 hectares, which is the majority of smallholder farmers, 0 to like about 2.5 hectares. So even that by itself was a problem.
Yeah.
So we started seeing a lot of these issues outside of just the AI technology itself.
Well, I'll stop you there, because what resonates with me about what you just said is something I say all the time, which is, even as we in the Caribbean or the global South, Latin America, Africa, pursue sustainable development, you just gave a perfect example of why you can't necessarily just lift something from the global north, whether it's software, whether it's hardware, or the combination of the two, and just drop it in and say, go.
Exactly.
And it works the same way. That's a perfect example. What it's programmed for, the height, the size, etc. So you realize all of this. So you needed to find some way to adapt that to the smaller farmers scenario.
Yeah, so of course we had to get in contact with the maker to figure out how to go and change that code. But the idea was, okay, so we do hundreds and hundreds of data points using this drone, and then at the same time we ran it through, again, this ecosystem of AI models that, again, I'm not a computer scientist, so maybe I might miss out some of the terminology, but it basically continuously mapped those results onto the results from a regular RGB camera.
Right.
So over time, you can start making kind of correlations between the imagery that you will get from a regular camera and what the sensors would provide as output. So we got to a point where we had, pretty good, I mean, it's not 100% accuracy, but you had enough to paint a decent picture that a farmer might want to use for sort of regular monitoring, or even extension officers to be able to do that. We looked at like water saturation, we looked at leaf health, and I think it was weed detection. So again, very simple parameters, but to sort of showcase that the model could work.
Sure.
And again, as we try to do at the foundation, which is this concept of catalyzing ideas, and you sort of hand over to the institutions whose mandate it is to take it forward.
Right.
We sort of handed it over to the institutions responsible for agriculture.
Love that. That's like an amazing example, kind of adaptation, bringing the price down, making it more relatable. I mean, one of the things, switching tacks, one of the things that I like to use these conversations to do is to sometimes to talk about term space that people aren't familiar with. They're like, what does that mean? And we haven't go into, taking sustainability courses, go into all of these conferences and talk a lot about regen ag or regenerative agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
You said sustainable agriculture. So maybe you could explain to someone listening, so what is this whole regenerative agriculture thing? What is it really? Why does it matter? And how does that apply kind of in our part of the
world? But I think, again, those adjectives, people sometimes use them interchangeably. Sometimes people have very strong, and maybe rightly so, philosophical distinctions between them or among them. But at least for me, you have a couple issues. One is that agriculture is still the most impactful sector on climate change, emissions, land degradation, biodiversity loss, and so on, because you just need so much land for particularly current consumer tastes and also the types of agriculture that we generally do, which is monoculture, massive swaths of land dedicated to a single crop and so on, or livestock. So regenerative agriculture is really about, again, recognizing that agriculture is one of the biggest drivers for sort of broad-based environmental change. So figuring out, okay, how do we not sacrifice our ability to feed ourselves, because that's pretty important, while also utilizing approaches that don't make it harder and harder each time to produce the same quantity of food, quality of food, without resorting to a bunch of artificial inputs, which is what the sort of modus operandi used to be. But then again, we realize that it's like this vicious cycle, because the more artificial inputs you use, in many cases, combined with that unsustainable type of agriculture, it just further and further degrades the ability of that ecosystem to produce food. So, it's understanding all of that to realize, one, are there traditional approaches that can be used on a bigger scale? Or do we try to rope in changes to consumer patterns that can maybe support, shifts on the supply side for how we grow things, where we grow things in particular, and how that all feeds into this kind of value chain of agriculture.
So on that last point because that's interesting in terms of the opportunity to shift on the consumer side. Because I mean, with what we do at Sustain You, or at least that part of our business, we started off in the trading space, but ultimately you realize behavior change. And you're kind of talking about a couple of different components of it. In this case, on the supply side, but also on the consumer side. So do you mean, for example, like if you could get consumers to have more demand for organic produce, for example, then that might create a change in behavior on the part of the suppliers, because they might not use sort of herbicide. Like, and is that an example of what you mean?
Yeah, I think it is an example, but also, again, we have an obsession with red meat, for example, and that cattle livestock area in particular is one of, within that agriculture sector, that subsector is one of the worst, I suppose, culprits when it comes to, emissions, land degradation, and so, because you just have to clear massive amounts of land. So again, where did that, because a lot of people never ate red meat, but as, not to go way back into history, but again, as industrial revolution and all these trade routes open up, people who might not have ever been exposed to beef or whatever now have the economic freedom and also access to it. And of course, you have all this marketing and stuff going on around it. So people's tastes have changed to, to support maybe agricultural activities that, a couple of generations back, they were not a big part of.
Sure.
And that's the same with things like, palm oil and all these other things that are so fundamental into a lot of the things that we use. But again, they can be affected by conscious shifts in what we choose. So at the foundation, for example, we've been really talking about we have very small events as compared to, massive workshops and conferences, but do we want to make everything we do vegetarian? So at least we, in our small way, try to eliminate the purchase of that particular food product.
Yeah.
And then you have other things about, like when we were looking for fruits to buy for this workshop, and all you can buy is apples. So even small things like that we take for granted and became a premium thing, like, around Christmas when you were younger, like if you had to have apples for Christmas,
they just come out, one
grapes.
Yeah, right.
So it became this premium thing. It became this status product. But then you have to kind of ask yourself, why? What is that doing? Can we not just buy something local instead?
Yeah.
So it's really about how you shift the patterns of consumption, because at the end of the day, that's what drives what's produced.
Yeah.
If people who are producers found themselves in a situation where they're undertaking this practice that may or may not be sustainable to produce something that the consumer no longer is that interested in, they would naturally make that change for themselves. Yeah.
Right. So you talked about kind of some of that, your events and other things, and that's a good example of sort of a way to shift behavior. So maybe give another example of, how you're getting into, training or education or finding other ways to shift the awareness, the appreciation of some of these issues.
Something we've not just started. We started it last year. We've embarked on this 3-year project around climate justice. So again, this idea that, climate change doesn't impact everyone equally. Many different people, because of power dynamics and who they are, where they are, they get either impacted more, get access to less resources to combat or adapt to those changes and so on. So we've started a 3-year project that's seeking to look at, one, people's awareness and their behavior, particularly from a political direction, around climate justice using arts. So we have a multi-pronged approach. Last year, we started with theater. So we started this micro theater climate justice festival in 2 rural communities, Brazil and Williamsville. And we worked with the community to develop, I think, between 8 to 10 micro theater plays. So they're 50 minutes long and they all happen at the same time.
Okay.
And they're created around real world issues around climate justice. So like in Williamsville, a lot of the plays were on flooding and the flooding impacts that they've had. In Brazil, it focused a lot on access to energy, deforestation, and that sort of thing.
So wait, is it the community that is almost performing and picking the issues that are relevant?
The community picked the issues and helped co-create the actual theatrical productions, but we had sort of professional actors. But we did have some persons from the community who were aspiring actors take part, and then we hosted it at the secondary schools within the communities over 2 days. And so people came to see, their sort of realities played out in front of them. And we got a really, really good feedback in terms of, the emotional impact that they had from seeing it played out, but also hearing what might be going on in different spaces. And then for this year, we're going to be focusing on literature, so climate fiction. So climate narratives, how can we kind of harness this really exciting time in Caribbean literature? Because, there's this boom in Caribbean fiction.
Yes.
So how can we try to harness that to tell stories about climate justice?
I love that.
So we're going to be starting that this year. Next year, we're looking at public art for climate. So we're going to be commissioning disruptive public art around climate justice. So things that are interactive in public spaces that get people thinking. So we had some ideas like, imagine you wake up to go to work in Port of Spain and there's this massive plexiglass aquarium with people working in it with water up to wherever the water level will be in 2100. And people are like, oh, this is interesting. What's going on here? So we want to do something disruptive like that.
Get people.
And then we're rounding out with Carnival, I think in 2026, talking about the old mass of climate politics. So we're going to be putting on this big old mass band around climate change and climate justice, as well as filming a documentary that combines that with the metaphor of the old mass of politics, which is basically there's all this drama and theatrics around climate policy and politics, but there's anything really happening under the surface. So we're hoping to do that to help change people's attitudes towards it, using things that are hopefully more in their grasp, which is the arts in different ways.
So I actually was at a conference and there was a climate comedian there, and it was just a good example of how you can kind of, to your point, use different approaches to break through and kind of shift the mindset. So as we wrap, you've been in this sort of space and on this journey for a long time. What gives you cause for optimism? In the face of all the challenges that we face in our part of the world, what gives you cause for optimism about our ability to develop in this space and to sort of turn things around?
I think a couple of things give me that optimism. I mean, I really believe firmly in the fact that we need to embrace this idea of not knowing enough. I mean, for me, it's kind of come out in being, I don't call myself it because I don't like to be called it, but almost like a perpetual student. Because I did sciences, I realized very early on that having never done a business subject in my life, I didn't know what was going on in the world. So I went and did an MBA. And then as I went on, I realized, I need to do something like leadership is becoming more and more important to me. So I did this thing at Cambridge. Now I'm doing stuff on inequality. And every single step along the way, I met people in those situations who are coming from places, and not just geographic, but also where they are in their life and careers, who are so kindred spirits in so many different ways that I always feel inspired that, there's always going to be someone who you could reach out to for support, and who is like-minded enough. And what also gives me optimism is the fact that there are so many people outside of those groups that I might meet in what I acknowledge to be very privileged positions, who are so passionate and so committed to their work. And these are people who run community groups, who run like Fisher Folk organizations, who run, groups that support, victims of domestic violence. And it's always a learning experience. You always get exposed to things that you've never known about.
Yeah.
And someone who I consider a mentor, Suniti Maraj, who's this journalist in Toronto, And she always says that the most radical thing you could do as a Caribbean person is unity, because historically we've been kind of forced to not be united for so many different reasons. So helping to create those spaces, which is what we try to do at the foundation, and what I think, we've become known for, is being that space where people trust us to come around the table. And often if you look around that table or that room, these people have never talked to one another. They might work in literally the same exact sector, but they've never had a conversation. They've never shared information. And seeing that happen in real time really gives me a lot of optimism. I mean, I like to call it purposeful naivety, because I just walk into a room and I just naively assume that everyone wants to work together.
Yeah.
And more often than not, surprisingly, that it works out. You would have these few stragglers who, they're just there for themselves, but seeing that happen, where people are able to enter a space and be like, oh, well, I think that I can find a way to collaborate with people here, or the space makes it easy for me to even consider that. That really gives me a lot of hope, because there's, especially in civil society and especially in the Caribbean, we can't even begin to do anything by ourselves at all. So for me, really kind of evangelizing that idea of just naively believe that people will work together. And I think people surprise you when they kind of align themselves with that particular value.
I love that. Well, Omar, thank you for sharing all of the work that you're doing, or some of the work that you're doing, actually, because I think we just scratched the surface of it, but also your perspective. I mean, I think, so much of what we try to do and what I want to do with this particular series is just to showcase the people who are trying to, as you said, kind of like carry their bucket of water and do something. And as you said, which to me is really powerful, if you have enough people doing it, becomes an army. They work together, and then you can have superior impact. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for taking some time to join us on Sustainability in the Global South.
It was fantastic.
Awesome.